Hi, everyone. So this will be the first part of two parts where we'll go into kind of the fundamentals of accident investigation and how that interacts with human performance specifically. If you've had any instruction in accident investigation before, a lot of this might be review, but I still hope there's something interesting there. All right, so to recap previous videos here, right, we want to find the cause, not blame. Keep in mind the concept of systems causation. Also consider resilience and fragility. And keep a critical eye towards an event that you're kind of thinking about or an example. So here's some definitions. We've covered some of these in the past, but just to be clear, so a root cause is a fundamental causal factor which, if corrected, will prevent recurrence. It doesn't mean it will solve all problems, but that particular problem can't happen again. A causal factor, just generally, is a factor that shaped the outcome of the situation. Extent of condition, this is a process or a task, as well as a concept, right? It's the extent to which a condition exists in other systems, processes, or tasks. And sometimes you will actually perform what's called an extent of condition assessment, where you go out to similar areas or systems and analyze them to see if the condition that caused your event is present elsewhere. Barriers, also sometimes called controls, are physical or administrative control designed to promote consistent performance and defend against inappropriate actions. Remember the slices of cheese in the Swiss cheese model. And then a corrective action, so measures taken to correct issues of quality. So these will be the final step, right, in an accident investigation, is to fix the things you find. And then finally, we have an extent of cause. So this is similar to extent of condition, but slightly different. So when you identify the root cause, is that root cause present, or does it have a potential to present itself in any other situation? It's a little bit more involved and a little bit more abstract sometimes, but at times, especially if you have a serious accident and you do identify a strong root cause, that can have widespread impact on an organization if you're able to mitigate that cause across the organizational space. Okay, so when we look at accident investigation, there's 7 steps. Secure the scene, document the scene, conduct your interviews, develop the sequence of events, conduct surface and root cause analysis, determine solutions, write the report. That's pretty consistent across industries, but as I've said before, be wary of whatever domain you're working in, and there may be other steps that are required or suggested based on that kind of disciplinary area. But these are the standard kind of concepts. And notice too that, if you get called in to investigate an accident, some of these will have already been done or will have been done by other folks. So that's why, when we think of securing the scene, documenting the scene, right, that can happen from local first responders all the way up to, in the event of like a transportation accident, there might be NTSB investigators that come in after the fact. And so be aware of how that interchange will all play out as well. So first, why do we secure the scene? The goal is to understand the immediate context as much as possible. So it's think of it as like an immersion experience if possible. We want to capture every aspect of what this context is at this moment. Material evidence tends to deteriorate after time or goes away, and memory is a massive risk in any accident investigation. So speaking of memory, we've talked about it a little bit before, but it's important to just kind of note how human memory tends to function. So we receive sense information and begin processing it. So that will land in your working memory and then will get saved into long-term memory if necessary, erased if not. When it goes into long-term memory, it gets encoded, which will give it specific categories. It will also chunk the memory, the scene or the gist, into some unit of separation. And the important thing to remember through this, right, is almost all of these processes happen subconsciously and we have nearly no control over it. There are ways to, develop a specific memory, the old write the word 50 times so that you'll know how to spell it for a spelling test that we might have done in elementary school or something like that. There are ways to fix those ideas or concepts more strongly, because recall also memory is a function of repetition, so frequency of use, and like time proximity. So you'll have a better shot typically at remembering things that happened recently. Not necessarily, but that tends to be how that works. So as we look at accident investigation, right, within seconds of things happening, people have already started forming memories about it. And remember what our brains do. They want clean, concise stories in their memory. We don't like stories that are missing the plot or the setting or things in our memory. So what your brain will tend to do if something is missing is it will fill it in with what it thinks is the most relevant to that scenario, which is oftentimes not accurate. And here's another example of the Battley model. So we talked a little bit about in there was some images in the graphic about declarative memory and some of those aspects. So this is a way also to look at it. So the working memory model determines there's sensory memory, which typically, if it does not need attention, just goes straight into a decay state and gets kind of shunted out because we don't need it. Attention, when our sense memory or our sensation and perception determines this is something that needs attention, it goes to what they deemed a central executive, which is split into two critical aspects, a visual spatial one and a kind of verbal reasoning angle. So they termed the visual one the visual spatial sketchpad, which tends to be like a representation of the visual and spatial characteristics of the event. Now, keep in mind, there are folks out there with aphantasia where they don't form visual artifacts in their brain. So their construction might be different and might manifest differently. And then you have the phonological loop, which focuses on kind of the verbal reasoning, sounds, speech, things that we hear. And then it goes back and forth between long-term memory as it's encoded or as it is recalled. So if we go back to that original tree, and this is a bit blurry, sorry about that. So when we're in an accident investigation, where are we living? Well, again, we're generally not there when it happens. So we're not in working memory space. We are trying to talk to people and or look at physical evidence, pictures, video, whatever, to try to get a sense of the context. And that will involve, at least for people, digging into long-term memory. So we have some of these breakdowns and aspects, and it can be helpful to understand how these all work for when you're interviewing people to kind of see what they're remembering. And what's important, like we said, is that memory is largely an unconscious process. So that's why you have to interview multiple people about an event. You have to get multiple angles of analysis because our memory is simply just not very reliable. This is also why first person testimony, or eyewitness testimony, as it's often called, tends to be bad. Not only is our memory unconscious, typically, it fills in its own holes without our input and is very easy to manipulate. So that doesn't mean we don't interview people, we don't talk to them about their eyewitness experience. What it means is that we take that with a grain of salt and we verify. It's kind of a trust but verify process there. So next we're going to look at schemas. So this is a really important concept for human performance investigation. So a schema, if we go back really quick to the Baddeley model, the chunking process that occurs between working memory and long-term memory builds the components of schemas. So a schema is a collection of chunks which, when assembled, can relate to some action or context. So this example here, I sense something, I pay attention, I sense something related to a dog, I attend to that, I then recall information from my memory about animals and dogs. We activate the adequate schema, we pull the dog one, and then we respond with what our past experience has told us is the appropriate action. Keep in mind, a lot of this happens very rapidly in a second or less, and a lot of it's unconscious, right? We don't consciously, we can, but we're not typically consciously looking through like a file cabinet of animals till we find the one we want. Typically that association is pretty tight, and so it tends to happen automatically. But a schema, so this example is one. Another example is walking into a store of any kind. Over our lives, we have, as children and growing up, we've been in various stores, and through observation and experience, we have seen the proper process and procedure of doing things within a store, how to wait in a line, different aspects like that. All of those, let's call them like procedures of acting in some given context, are built on schemas. That's why you can go into a new store, but by stepping in, you can ascertain what kind of a store is this. And that then will think about the animal selection process, right? You'll pick maybe from specific types of stores or retail establishments, and that will drive how you interact there. The way we walk through a grocery store is a lot different from the way we might walk through like a Hot Topic, right? So that's important to realize. And by the time we get involved from an accident perspective, those schemas are set. So when we ask them to recall an event, just like I said, how your brain fills in gaps, it does the same with the schemas when it's recalling them. Let's say that person recalls their schema of what occurred, but that schema had gaps. It had, absent information that it was expecting when it was encoded. So when it gets recalled, your brain can merge schemas to try to give you a complete one, which again can be very difficult. So that's why interviewing, which is a topic we'll get into later, is such a critical task and is an art to be perfected in these spaces. So that whole discussion about memory was just to remind you that memory is fragile. It can be manipulated easily and subconsciously. So for example, there was an experiment done, and I have never been able to find the actual citation, so it could be apocryphal. I'm not positive, but there was a situation where they took adults that had allegedly never been lost in a mall or like a department store from their parents, and were able to give them enough threads of a memory that those people, their brains subconsciously charged forward and gave them fully constructed memories of being lost in those establishments, even though they didn't have them before. And memory alone isn't enough. Just because somebody says something happened doesn't mean that's the way it happened. It doesn't mean they're lying. It could mean that they're misremembering or their memory is, messing with them a little bit. It could be that it was a perspective issue, so that's the way they perceive it happened from their perspective. So that's why we always validate with evidence and proof. We always look around. And this is another thing. Some people will eschew interview evidence as subjective and they won't use it, which is really leaving a lot of money on the table, so to speak, when it comes to an accident investigation. You want a mix of objective evidence plus subjective evidence at all times. That'll give you the best picture of what happened. Like, for example, if somebody says they heard a snap, okay, and maybe objective evidence is you found a snapped log or branch. Those kind of match up, but without having the context. If you just find a broken branch on the ground, right, you don't know what was the context of how it broke. But if somebody says, oh yeah, the wind picked up out of nowhere and it was like this huge gust, okay, the subjective evidence gave you a better picture of what occurred than just the objective evidence alone. But the two together give you a clearer story. Next is documenting the accident scene. So there are accident investigation kits out there, just kind of general ones that maybe comply with like an OSHA process or different things like that. But they can be super helpful. They also may be required depending on your domain or what context you're operating in. So be aware of that, hopefully before an accident occurs. But how do you know what matters and needs documented? And the truth is, initially, you don't. That's why, right, in every police procedural and even actual crime scenes, what do police officers do when there's an event? They keep everybody as far away from it as possible, and they rope off the whole area. They kind of quarantine this area because they don't know what is important and what isn't in that moment. So they have to, start doing investigating, talking to people, and start putting together the event so that they can then inform, right, what needs to be kept. So when you're looking at specific events that you might have in mind or have looked at for this course, was anything recorded that wasn't used, or did anything unexpected become important? As best as you can tell, sometimes these aren't super accessible items of information. Sometimes you have to go mining through long government reports. But when you're there on site, use your 5 senses. All of those matter. Why do they matter? Because sense memory is incredibly powerful at actually bringing back accuracy to memory. So by linking memories with senses, it makes the recall more accurate. So if you can, what does it look like? What does it sound like, smell like? All of those things are relevant and need to be noted. The environment matters. Where are you? Are you inside, outside? What's the weather? What are there other aspects? Is this a loud environment? It may not be when you get there to investigate it, but what's the standard context of occurrence not occurrence, but the standard context of work in this space or tasks? Always, always draw or sketch the scene. Always. However detailed you want to make it, the more detailed, the better. But, we don't have to get out, compasses and protractors and measure everything. I mean, somebody should probably do that. But for our initial investigation, we need to know roughly where things are located relative to each other and how the process flow laid out. If you do this well, it will save you a ton of time when you go to actually map out the event. And then pictures, videos, drawings, all critical in the future steps. They're all going to be things that we need. So all of them are valuable. And this is actually just a point I've often wondered, and I actually would be interested, like if police departments and just law enforcement, first responders in general, the proliferation of like body cameras and things. I think about those from like an investigative potential. I know that they're often where we see them in the media or whatever, where people are videoed when they're getting pulled over or whatever, or in different events. But even let's say it's not an emergent law enforcement event, like an officer involved shooting or something, if it's just an investigation, right? I've often wondered, as the detectives show up, so to speak, they should wear a body camera. I would think that would be incredibly important in training and just looking back at, okay, what did this trained, seasoned investigator look at that's different from maybe what a new person would? And does looking back over that footage, is that helpful? Typically I think they're relying on images, drawings, things after the fact. But I do wonder, right, if we had a video recording of where the investigator went, what they looked at, what they thought in that moment, if that would be valuable after the fact. Okay, so sketch examples. So typically there are two main methods of sketching something. Now these are both obviously computer generated. You could probably draw this way, but you may not. But they're very clear examples, right, of how to do it. So there's the triangulation method, where you identify where the victim is and you take measurements to other fixed objects, especially objects that are related to the event. So in this one, there was a high voltage line, a pole, you have the weather and the temperature and the time noted above, a rough sketch of the environment. You then have this triangulation method where you center on the victim in this instance, or whatever was the object of the event, and you start to triangulate that to various aspects, right, of what's going on here. And that's how you can go. So in this instance, it appears from this drawing that, okay, we've got a high voltage line, we've got some bad weather, but it's in the afternoon. There's a pole over there. This victim has a ladder, and he is some distance away from the pole and some distance away from this high voltage line. So we can kind of assume, and I don't know for sure, but this person might have been carrying a ladder and the ladder was just too tall and it hit the high voltage line and electrocuted this victim. The next option here is a timeline method, where you capture, again, a lot of these information points. Notice here we have a lot of measurements of the operator, the top of the load, the bottom of the load, travel speed. Those are all very, very important details to know for after the fact when you try to reassemble all of this. And then we can kind of see, okay, this operator was trying to navigate some kind of a forklift, it appears, and maybe hit somebody. But we have a direction of motion of the deceased, so the person was walking and then they're in front of the forklift. So by tracking the motion and the intended direction, we are looking at timelines. So this is where the person was intending to go, and then we have whatever inciting event occurs in the middle of those intentions, and then we have the event is the result, and then we can try to step that back by looking at the timeline. So that is, those are both two different ways of demonstrating the event. And again, as always, be aware of your area, your domain, because one of these might be more effective for the use case you're in. Initial statement collection. So as you're doing initial just discussions about things with when you first reach out to people, now most witnesses or people that were involved in an event, you will talk to multiple times. But in this initial one, right, I always like to stress the single most important question you can ask is, can you tell me anyone else we should talk to or who might have helpful information? Two reasons why that works well psychologically. One, in the moment after an event, people are very, very self-centered. That's a biological response. Something dramatic happened. Our brains trigger to protect ourselves. So it's hard for us to just naturally think of others. Now, the second what reason you ask this is to get people to point the finger, so to speak, right? Especially in an event, if somebody was a witness or was involved, was maybe the person who did the incorrect action, they would love nothing more than for you to talk to somebody else. So it's a good question because it shakes people out of that self-centered mindset initially, and then it gives them, right, that psychological out of pointing at somebody else, which even if they're not trying to assess blame, right, it still opens up their mind a little bit. And best case, you find somebody who you should talk to about this and who might have helpful information. So I always stress that, right, is like that's the most important thing. You also want to explore anything that has been moved or changed about the scene since the accident, right? We've all seen in like police TV shows where they show somebody images of a crime scene and they ask, is anything out of place? Does anything look weird to you? That is incredibly valuable because, again, we're not asking somebody to remember a scene. We're asking them to recognize if this current scene you're showing them matches a previous scene. So remember, at this point, we're leveraging schemas, and that is a much more accurate way to get humans to process information. If you just ask them to describe the scene the way it was prior to an accident, you're really opening yourself up to a lot of different filler in that story. Where if you say, here's the scene when we got there, show them pictures, video, whatever, does anything look out of place, abnormal, or different since from what you remember of the accident or even of just the context normally? Also remember, we're looking for the cause. We are not looking to blame people. Obviously, in many accident investigations, people will get blamed, but that is not our role to investigate the accident. As a result, you need to focus as much. Now, you can't walk into here and if somebody says, am I going to get fired? You can't be like, oh, no, you're going to get promoted, or no, that's not going to happen. It's about, those are not decisions you're involved with. You're just here to try to figure out what happened. You have no preconceived notions. You don't think this person did anything wrong. We're just trying to get a sense for what happened. By doing that right, you elicit a good first impression and you generate goodwill that will be incredibly helpful later. A lot of times as you start to pull apart root causes, you will find that the system has more of a cause than a person. So by building that goodwill, right, people will be more likely to open up. They'll be more likely to remember things because, again, when we're not in that fear response, we can think more broadly and try to take more of a helpful approach. And these are all like psychological things that help us try to find the truth. And lastly, remember, no one wants to talk to the Bobs deciding if they get fired or not. So, stating that you're not doing that is super important. And we're skipping that one. Okay. 7 steps of accident investigation. So, as we said, conducting interviews, most difficult part of the investigation, but is typically the most critical and valuable. And I strongly recommend that you prepare as much as possible. So preparation is the key. All right. Okay, so 4 elements of a good interview. Preparation. Know the 5 W's and H, so the what, when, where, why, and how, for your interview process and goals. So you should already prepare what, according to your insights, your information happened, how it happened, and everything. And also accept humility. At this point, you don't have a clue what happened. You just know what a context or a scene looked like and things that happened. And your brain will automatically jump to conclusions to try to fill in those gaps in the story. But you have to push back against that. Know what you know, but be open, especially in these interviews, to being wrong. You might get people that go in and say, oh, no, that's not what happened. I wasn't even there, because they're trying to get out of it or something, and you have evidence that they were there. But vice versa, you will also, if you approach it humbly, you'll get people that maybe correct you and say, oh, no, that's actually not what happened. This is what happened. People love to be the expert. They love to teach, typically. So if they feel like they can be an expert relative to you or teach you something about the event, they will open up more. And the way you get there is preparation. You lay out how you are going to expect this interview to go, what your goals are with the interview. So what are you trying to answer? And those aren't questions you're typically going to open up the interview and just start drilling into the person. No, you're going to ask them to walk you through this, and simultaneously you're going to be comparing what you know from the scene or those things to what they're saying to try to, again, find the truth. Your opening sets the tone. It establishes trust and rapport, right? That's where you stress, I'm just here to try to figure out what happened. It's kind of one of those, it's kind of a Dorothy approach, right? You landed here, you're not sure why, you're not sure where you are, what's occurring, and you need this person's help to make sense of it. That's helpful. Questioning process. So have a plan for the interview, know your question strategy. This relates, if you've ever heard the phrase that a good lawyer, never asks a question they don't already know the answer to. That is a critical way for you to approach it. Now, don't take the lawyerly approach of, oh, but you said this happened, but it appears that this happened, where you're trying to bait people. Remember, we're not lawyers. This isn't a court of law. We're just trying to figure out what happened. So pump the brakes on that a little bit. But you still should have an idea of, when I ask this question, I'm expecting the person to say this. Because then if they don't, that's an anomaly that you can dig into, because maybe they're lying or they're misremembering. Maybe you're wrong. And again, the goal is the truth, not being correct. And then closing up, you always want to ask follow-up information or additional contacts, and you reestablish the tone from the beginning. So as much as possible, try to mirror your opening. You know, if you have a certain phrase, if you said a thing, if you stood up and shook the person's hand, whatever, do the same things. Try to bookend it, if that makes sense. So as we prepare for an interview, sketch timeline of the events using available information, develop your list of interviewees, list of questions. Keep in mind, your questions may change, but at least initially, right? Your questions that you give to the interviewees should largely be similar, because on this initial pass, right, you want to try to bias the process as little as possible. And typically, especially anytime we're dealing with humans, so this is true in like psychological research studies, right? We try to use a script whenever possible. We try to make sure every participant, or in this case interviewee, has the exact same experience. So if you do that and you're able to kind of give a consistent experience to the users, if you get wildly different results from the interviews, then you know that you're missing stuff, and you can go back and kind of sort that out. And then your interview questions in in future interviews may shift, because maybe you identify a key aspect that maybe you're missing. So then you go back and say, hey, what happened here or whatever with this thing? Because maybe that's what you identified. And that also helps you, again, if you approach it humbly, where you're asking for their insight and help, we're more likely to get people that'll help us. Also, develop an error-free scenario that describes how the task should have progressed. What was the correct progression? That way you can identify the point of deviation. And as you walk people down, right, certain interviewees may have a different point of deviation. They might have an opinion about how this went wrong. And this is really important for techniques down the road, especially as we do change analysis. So where did it all go wrong? We're trying to assess, okay, steps 1 through 7, everybody did everything right. Step 8, everything went wrong. What could potentially occur that would make step 8 wrong? And that'll limit your scope a little bit, which is helpful. Obviously, fight the bias. Finding facts to suit theories is backwards. That's why you really have to fight that initial unconscious reaction that your brain will have to make this make sense to you based on your experience and your beliefs or whatever. You have to actively fight that. That is, and it'll get easier with practice, but your brain will do that. There is no way to stop it. There's no amount of training we can give you to make it not do that. That's just the way our brains work. But by being aware of it, we can force ourselves to keep the proper perspective. Why did it happen? Versus why did we let it happen? Or why did so-and-so make it happen? No. Why did it happen? So those what questions need to be answered, right? What happened? Why did it happen? Why didn't we see it coming? Why didn't we stop it? And what are we going to do about it? And notice, if you look at these questions, right, if we already have a preconceived notion, like if you can look at this and you have an answer to all these questions, you need to go back and check your bias. Because especially as accident investigators, we were not there. We can't have the answer to all these questions. We can have maybe a rough what happened, I would hope. We know what's going on. There was a car accident, a plane crash, something occurred. So we know what happened, but we really don't know any of the rest of this. If you go into those initial, some of these initial stages and you have answers to these questions, you're already off track. And having those answers will bias you. It will bias everything about the investigation because that's the way humans work. So we have to be conscious. Our human nature is the greatest risk to an investigation. Okay, problem statements. So this is a very tricky thing and something that typically requires a lot of practice to get right. So don't get predisposed to the cause and trying to determine the problem to be solved. You want to precisely define a problem to prevent, and you are halfway to a solution if you have the problem statement done correctly. Word problems are very difficult for a reason. Our brains crave context and explanatory facts. We need the why and other aspects of the event or system or process. And creating a quality problem statement is the foundation of the entire analysis. So it should be a single, concise problem statement that identifies the specific issue being evaluated. You want to state the object, the deviation, details of the problem specified in terms of when, what, when also could be applicable here if that's the object. The object of the event, the deviation, and the consequence. And it is so hard to write these without including a bunch of explanatory nonsense that we don't need. So don't state a why. Those are causative. We have no interest in causes. We're talking about a problem. Don't state potential corrective actions. Don't state the what should have happened. Do identify adverse effects or consequences of the stated problem and the severity of those consequences. So this action was incorrect, which led to this pump failing, which led to this amount of lost revenue, etc., etc. Do ensure the problem statement contains only one problem and condition. This is where a lot of people go awry. They end up including what they think are contextual facts, but are really just another problem. Each problem statement needs to be unique. And do use the problem statement to maintain focus during the investigation. Always come back to it. So here's an example. On December 19, 2008, at 16:51, with Unit 3 and Mode 3, a loose fuse connection in the control circuitry for 3HV4716 auxiliary feed water pump 3P140 steam inlet valve caused the Unit 3 control room to receive an alarm window 3UA0052A53 turbine aux feed water pump governor overspeed/OOS alarm. Notification 2002539111. Auxiliary feed water pump 3P140 was declared inoperable. 72-hour action statement. At 16:51, as per technical specification LCO 3.7.5, action B requiring 3 operable auxiliary feed water pumps in modes 1, 2, and 3. That is a lot, and a lot that we don't need. So here's another example. On 12/19/2008, a loose fuse connection in the control circuitry for auxiliary feed water pump 3P140 steam inlet valve resulted in declaring the pump inoperable. There you go. And look at how much simpler it is compared to all of this. So like, for example, the alarm notification here, that's has no point really for this in terms of a problem statement. Now there might be instances where you need to write up an event like this, but when we're doing an investigation and we have a problem statement, we want to look at something like this. All right, so then we're going to take a step back, looking at like the broader accident investigation, right? Here's an example of a potential timeline progression, right? The numbers on the charting below represent days, but these are not prescriptive, right? Be aware of your context. Some events in certain contexts have requirements for these steps. Adhere to those. These are just examples. So initially you're going to have your interim actions. Maybe we put something in a safe condition, etc. Do an extent of condition. You'll move to initial data gathering, complete some interviews, and that should lead to your evidence collection ending. But the whole time you're doing analysis of facts, and you should be report writing. Please don't save it till the end. It'll be horrible. Do it as you go through. You can always rewrite and edit, but it's hard to start at the very end when you have to get this report done in a few days. You'll have initial analysis completed, move into conclusions, a draft corrective action plan. You'll draft a report and socialize it, as well as your proposed corrective action plan. Final report completed and approved, etc., etc. This is typically how these things tend to go. But keep in mind, for some events, these are very long timelines. So, just be aware. So as you go into developing the sequence of events, this is really critical. So understand the order of events from a logical perspective, from a fact-based perspective. So to note that fact-based means you have evidence to say this is the way it happened, not this is the way the procedure says it should have happened. That's not a fact-based order of events. That's a procedure-based order of events, but they're different. Always focus on cause, not blame. Notice this is a recurring theme in this video. That could be because it's really hard for us to do this as humans, and we have to reiterate it to ourselves. You want to understand the characteristics of the event, actor versus action. So break that down. You have a characteristics of an actor, but then you have characteristics of an action. For some events, the action might not match the actor. That's where you get to instances of it was just so out of character, etc. And that might be a clue to what's going on, that might be a cause you need to look at. And be aware of the system causation challenges in determining the true sequence of events. So as we've discussed, system causation means that we're all a part of some global system. So it can be very difficult to untangle causes. And as a result, a lot of people just take the easy way out and attribute it to some kind of a human problem. Oh, the manager wasn't paying enough attention or wasn't doing oversight enough. Oh, the person wasn't trained well enough. Or the person made the error. We should get rid of the person. Or maybe they all just need retrained and these kind of things. Those are cop-outs and easy ways out. We need to do real work to understand what happened. Is it possible somebody wasn't trained? Totally. But then I would just ask, why were they able to do it successfully before? Now, if not, if this is that person's first day and they just did something, okay, that's a different scenario. But typically, events occur around tasks or actions that have occurred successfully many times before. So it can't just be that people aren't trained because they were able to do it before. And I don't know about you, but generally in my life, most things I've had to be trained to do, I couldn't do successfully at the beginning without training. And then as we go back to right, you'll conduct your surface and root cause analysis. So we'll go into this in a lot more detail, but cause analysis tools and methods, we'll be going into these, barrier analysis, change analysis, event and causal factor charting, extent ofs. So this is your condition, your extent of cause, those kind of things. There's others as well. You can have why trees, what if analysis, all those things. Task analysis, so this is a very specific methodology where we're going to break down the task from a human perspective based on whatever methodology we select. And you may find other human performance challenges or design failures. This is incredibly important when you have an action that doesn't have a defined and laid out process, right? Any event where we're going to rely on what often is termed like a skill of the craft kind of thing of, oh no, we don't need to proceduralize this electrician task because any journeyman electrician knows how to do this properly kind of thing. So in those instances, right, sometimes we have to go all the way back and do a task analysis to try to understand where the correct progression is and where the human characteristics can gum that up. When we determine solutions, we're looking at effective corrective action plans. You want a clear linkage between the cause and corrective actions. Every cause must have a corrective action. Every corrective action is tied to a cause. Don't make things worse. That's like the golden rule with the corrective action, right? So what does that mean? That means you need to sanity check or test your corrective action before it becomes a corrective action, right? If you think it will be impactful, but you're making some change, let's talk to some folks involved, or maybe even do a couple scenario run through, some role play to see if it will work or if it introduces new problems. Include the intent of the action. So what are you trying to bring about with the corrective action? You'll document the completed corrective actions. This is a critical step. Corrective action should only be deemed completed when you have evidence and documentation that they were completed. If you're supposed to put a barrier up, you're not going to believe that it's done until you see a picture of the barrier up or you investigate it yourself. You will develop interim corrective actions, which are often to maintain the safety and security of the site or process to try to make sure you don't have repeats of the event while you're investigating. And leading to that, consider the risk to repeat recurrence during the completion of the overall plan. So maybe there's an interim corrective action that you didn't think to take because maybe it's kind of a harsh step, like it's a big stick for the problem, but it's the only way to prevent repeat recurrence with this process. So maybe that's what you need to take. Okay, this is the end of part 1. So next week we will get into part 2, where we'll get into more of those tools and processes and methods. Thanks.